We are back with some Vue.js org docs read-through. We are in the components in-depth section, and we are in the last chapter, async components. Async components, basic usage. In large applications, we may need to divide the app into smaller chunks and only load a component from the server when it's needed. Chunk splitting. To make that possible, Vue has a define async component function. Import define async component const. We define our component. We run this function and we provide inside as a first argument a function which returns a new promise which resolves into a component. And then async comp, it says apologies. Async comp we can use as a normal component. As you can see, define async component accepts a loader function that returns a promise. The promise resolve callback should be called when you have retrieved your component definition from the server. You can also call reject reason to indicate the load has failed. ES module dynamic import also returns a promise, so most of the time we will use it in combination with async component. Bundlers like Vite and Webpack also support the syntax, so we can use it to import Vue single file components. Import define async component, and then we get its value, its return value when we call it, and with a function that returns a dynamic import of the component. The resulting async comp is a wrapper component that only calls the loader function when it is actually rendered on the page. In addition, it will pass along any props to the inner component. So you can use the async wrapper to seamlessly replace the original component while achieving lazy loading. Loading and error states. Asynchronous operations inevitably involve loading and error states. True. Define async component supports handling these states via advanced options. We have our defined async component, and then we pass in, instead of a function, an object. The object has a key loader, which is what we were passing before, the function that returns a dynamic import. It has a loading component, which is a component to use while the async component is loading, and it has a delay, which is the delay before showing the loading component. All right. Then we have an error component, which is the one to display if the load fails or errors out. And then the error component will be displayed if a timeout is provided and exceeded. The timeout after which the error component should be displayed. The default is infinity. If we set 3000, that means 3000 milliseconds, therefore 3 seconds. So this component will attempt to load this foo component, or this function will attempt to load this component foo. In the meantime, and after a delay of 200 milliseconds, it will display this loading component, and after 3 seconds, or after this import errors out, the error component will be displayed. If a loading component is provided, it will be displayed first while the inner component is being loaded. There is a default 200 millisecond delay before the loading component is shown. This is because on fast networks, an instant loading state may get replaced too fast and end up looking like a flicker. That's that's a very nice consideration. If an error component is provided, it will be displayed when the promise returned by the loader function is rejected. You can also specify the timeout to show the error component when the request is taking too long. Using with suspense, async components can be used with the suspense built-in component. The interaction between suspense and async components are documented in the dedicated chapter of suspense. And that's it for components in depth. Next, after a break, we'll go into reusability and composables.